Hey everyone, this is another BookTube channel, and today I'll be reviewing Room to Dream by David Lynch and Christine McKenna. This is a half biography, half memoir about the filmmaker David Lynch. I don't read a ton of nonfiction. I usually stick to genre fiction, and I don't read a lot of biographies in particular. I think usually, especially famous people, I think that they think that their lives are a lot more interesting than they actually are. But I read this one, I gave it a shot because I do like David Lynch a lot, and if you've ever seen one of his movies, you know that he's probably a pretty weird or interesting guy, and getting a potential insight into what made him the way he is was a little bit appealing. So I figured, I like David Lynch. Another extreme deciding factor of reading this was that my wife read it and she liked it, and she told me that I should read it so we could talk about it. So if she hadn't done that, even though I like David Lynch, this probably would have been extremely low on my TBR. But I squeezed it into January because not only did we want to talk about it, but since she read this, we want to do a David Lynch career watch. So starting with Eraserhead and then up through his most recent stuff with Twin Peaks: The Return. Just watch all of his movies and TV shows. So I figured I would also prepare for that. So I mentioned this is a half biography, half memoir. That's probably one of the more interesting things about this book is the way that it's written and presented. So it is by David Lynch and Christine McKenna. Christine McKenna is, I believe, just a journalist or some kind of writer. I'm sorry, I didn't do any research. But each chapter is broken into two sections. The first section is Christine, who has taken the factual series of events of David's life, and she's presenting them in that way. She's also interviewed people close to David. She's found interviews of people talking about David, and she's pieced them together on this timeline to create just a picture of his life from childhood to most recent. This was published, I think, 2018, 2019, so it's pretty recent. So yeah, up to that time period. And then the second half of each chapter is David Lynch providing his perspective on the events that Christine is mentioning in the first half. So it's a lot of him saying, I don't remember things happening that way. This is what I remember. Or, yeah, what you said is probably important, but what was really important to me was this dinner that I had that night. Which is one of the interesting parts of this book is really seeing what is important to David Lynch, because as a filmmaker and as a human being, he generally doesn't see things, I would say, the way most people do. He's a very optimistic person. And by all accounts, every single person in this book says that David was an absolute dream to work with. And they've never had a better experience on set. And the amount of women that fall in love with him. I mean, he's been married 4 or 5 times. He says that he's never not had a girlfriend, since he was in public school, in grade school. He's always had a girlfriend, sometimes multiple at the same time, and women just fall in love with him immediately, to the point where it seems almost like a parody. I don't want to believe it, but then again, these people didn't have a gun to their head, and they really didn't have a reason to lie about falling in love with David Lynch. So I guess he's just an absolute chick magnet. Good for him. But yeah, it's really interesting to just see how he thinks about his own work and why he made certain decisions and why he did some of what he did. He talks about the Red Room in Twin Peaks and how the Red Room was really important to him because he loves curtains. That was his reasoning. He loves curtains. He loves the way that they look because they're beautiful, but also because they hide something. And it's that if you've ever watched Twin Peaks, if you ever had a conversation with someone who's really into that show and that world, the symbolism of the Red Room and of everything that happens in the show, people write college dissertations about it. Like, it is the stuff of student theses. And then you have David Lynch, who's just saying, oh yeah, I like the Red Room. I like curtains a lot, and it's funny because he simplifies things down to just like what he likes, and even though he is all about the symbolism and all about the themes, the way he gets there, it's not like, I get the feeling that he's not mapping it out the way that people think he's mapping it out, the way people retroactively map out his works to say, like, connect these dots. He's just going by feeling. And I think that's pretty interesting. The downside of that is that these can be a little bit repetitive, these chapters, because it is just David being just like, I love everything in the world, so I just put whatever I was interested in that shot, in that movie, in that show. This style also lends itself to a lot of downtime in this book. Not everything here is extremely interesting. David sometimes goes off on tangents, little just stories that about the people that he met at that time that don't really go anywhere. It's just a little bit of flavor, and I guess that works for one of his movies, is adding in those extra touches. For a book, though, kind of detracts a little bit, kind of derails it. I wouldn't say this is a difficult read, but it's also a little bit disjointed, which again, I guess, matches what David Lynch would want in a product with his name on it. It's not enough to do something in a linear fashion that's boring. He wants to divert, and he wants to stop progress and go back in time and really get into the minutia of it and really evoke a feeling. That's what his work's all about, is evoking feelings in the audience. So if that's what he's going for, this book works pretty well in that. But I will admit, I skimmed a good portion of this, particularly the chapters that don't have to do with his movies. Like, the first 2 chapters are just about his childhood and early schooling, and like I don't care. Like I don't care about celebrities' lives generally. I don't care what school you went to. I don't care what your parents were like. I like your movies. I like David Lynch movies. Tell me about the movies. So the chapters about the movies, I found pretty interesting. They're not, but you might not get what you want out of the David portions of these chapters. The Christine stuff, it's very historical and matter of fact, and just, this is what happened, this is who did it, and when and where. That stuff's really interesting. And with David, because of how his movies are, you want him to go and explain what he was thinking and what he was feeling and how did this come to be. And he doesn't give you that satisfaction, which is 100% on brand for him. That's his character. The whole point of him is you gotta interpret his movies. He's not gonna tell you what the movie was about. But nevertheless, it could still be disappointing because you want a little bit something. You want the genesis of where these ideas come from his own personal experiences, and you don't always get that here. It's mostly just, yeah, and then I got the idea for Mulholland Drive, or I've had the idea for Blue Velvet for a while. Well, okay, let's explore that, but not really. He just talks about going to dinner with Dino De Laurentiis. There's a lot of good stuff in here, but it can also be a little bit frustrating. And now that I'm talking it out, that's exactly what David Lynch would want, is to, whet your appetite, make you want more of it, not quite get exactly what you want, but have to think about it and just react to your own feelings about it. So he's probably pretty happy with how this turned out. This book also kind of reinforced my pre-existing feelings about biographies, which is I really don't care about the individual, the actual person of the famous person that I like, because I like David Lynch movies, And from what I saw of, what I have seen in the past of interviews with him or behind the scenes stuff, he seems like, a pretty okay guy. But then once you start to, get to know them a bit more, they can be a little bit off-putting. I think there are a few things in here that might turn a few people off of David Lynch. He's really big into transcendental meditation, which I think is a cult. Like, it sounds like a little bit like a cult. Like, it's got the figurehead of the Maharishi, and I think it's like it's retreats, and he started like a foundation that like generates interest in it. He's got like a center in like Sweden or I don't know, some country about it, and like you have to pay like $1,500 to learn the technique. I don't know. It just seems like a little fishy, like not quite to the level of Scientology, but like with Scientology out there, I'm just wary of anything that a famous person is like, hey, you should come join my group that you have to pay a lot of money to be a part of. He also sometimes says very complimentary things about pretty divisive figures. Nobody like extreme, but I do believe he makes mention of liking Ronald Reagan in here, and like, Ronald Reagan is someone who is pretty divisive nowadays in terms of his legacy. I think it was Reagan. I don't think it was Nixon. Maybe it was Nixon. It was either Reagan or Nixon. Either way, pretty divisive figures. Now, he also calls Dr. Mehmet Oz a good person. So I don't know about that one. But yeah, so if you are very active politically, or if you are very wary of stuff like Scientology, maybe you would find David Lynch to be kind of like, I don't want to hang out with him after this book. It's also a pretty easy read, especially if you know how David Lynch speaks. You can read his sections in his voice, and it just makes it a little bit more enjoyable and more fun. If it was anybody else, it probably wouldn't be. But if you know that David's really high nasally voice and his almost childlike optimism that he puts behind everything, makes it a lot easier to read. I will say though, the moments where I wasn't reading this book, I didn't care about it at all. Like I would put it down, and then I would forget that it exists, and then I would go through an entire day, and I would say, oh, I didn't read any Room to Dream tonight. Let me pick it up. And then once you pick it up, you can get through 80, 90, 100 pages pretty simply, especially if you're interested in what that chapter is about. There's also a lot of cool photographs in here of David throughout the years, as a child, as a college student, with people on set, stuff like that. So, it's good for that reason as well. Overall, pretty decent biography. If I were to assign an arbitrary and subjective grade to Room to Dream, I'd give it a 6 out of 10. I probably wouldn't read it again, and I would recommend it to people who like David Lynch. If you don't like David Lynch movies and you're not interested in the insights into his life and how those movies came to be, you're not going to care about this at all, and that's totally fine. If you're a fan of David Lynch, or if you've read this book, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the man or the book. Thank you for spending some time with me today. But now, it's time to get back to reading.